chairing the 5th session, which is on sustainable development and resource use, a topic that was very dear to the late Professor Dennis Panton. So I'm very happy that we have quite a distinguished panel, students who are working on this issue that is still such relevance, importance for the Caribbean economies and certainly for Trinidad and Tobago. I'm going to ask each of the presenters to present in turn. There's a possibility that we would have a discussion at the end of it, led by Mr. Gregory Maguire, who unfortunately isn't here as yet. If he isn't here, I would just go straight into the question and answer session as it were. So I'm pleased to now introduce the three presenters. We have Mr. Gopichan Bulan, who is an MPhil student in the Department of Economics, and he will be presenting an economic analysis of landfill gas energy projects in the islands. He is also in preparation, as it were, for being upgraded to PhD status later this year. So I know I'm eagerly looking forward to hearing what he has to say on this particular topic. Our second presenter is Wade Dottin, who is also a master's student in the Department of Economics. He will be presenting on, is it sustainability, TNT? Are we? Yes. So that also seems to be very interesting topic, so I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what they will be presenting on. So I'll allow the presenters to do that in turn. Finally, the last presenter is Amanda Thomas, and she will be presenting on the structuration of community decline in a natural resource dependent community, NRDC, in South Trinidad. She is doing this research in collaboration with Jason Tamby. And so she will be the presenter, but I believe that Jason, who is also sitting on the floor here, will also be available to take your questions afterwards. So without much further ado, I would like to ask Mr. Gopichan Bulan to come and give his presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I will be presenting on economic analysis.
Can you speak loudly, please? They have difficulty hearing.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This morning I'll be presenting on an economic analysis of natural gas to energy projects in the island state of Trinidad and Tobago. And outline of the presentation is as follows. I will start with an overview, then I will go into the profile of Trinidad and Tobago in terms of landfills and waste. Then I will go into natural gas energy projects. Then I will go into the structure of the research, then the methodology and results, and then finally conclude. The general context under which this paper is done is in terms of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, climate change has become a global issue since the year 2000 and gained importance due to its realized impact on countries around the world. Now, climate change is linked to the emission of greenhouse gases, and one such gas is methane. Now, in the context under which this study is done is based on sustainable green energy and sustainable waste management. Now, energy is critical for sustainable development, in which it impacts on all aspects of development, whether it be economic, social, and environmental. Most waste in Trinidad and Tobago is disposed of into landfills, but it is identified that these landfills are near capacity. In relation to electricity generation, 99.9% of electricity is generated from fossil fuel, which is natural gas in Trinidad and Tobago. But in terms of renewable energy, generation is minimal. Therefore, the research identified that there is a lack of waste management, as well as renewable energy content in Trinidad and Tobago. In 2010, Trinidad and Tobago was ranked 61st out of 200 plus countries in terms of emissions from fossil fuels. It is also identified that greenhouse gas emissions have potential negative impact on the environment as well as on humans, especially emissions from landfills. And as a result, there's need to mitigate these emissions and promote sustainable waste management and renewable energy in Trinidad and Tobago. Therefore, the research question is to determine whether it is economically or environmentally feasible to manage municipal solid waste as an energy resource by the use of landfill gas energy projects to generate power in Trinidad and Tobago. The research seeks to bring to the forefront the potential socio-economic and ecological impacts of implementing landfill gas to energy projects in Trinidad and Tobago. The four main objectives is to determine the quantities of methane emitted from main landfills in Trinidad, determine the amount of electricity that can be generated if we capture this methane, go into a cost and benefit analysis to identify whether these projects would be economically feasible to be implemented at the landfill sites. Table 1 is just to illustrate a summary of the main literature looked at for this research, which consists of solid waste management, sustainable green energy cost benefit analysis, and landfill gas to energy projects. The profile of Trinidad and Tobago in terms of solid waste management. As mentioned before, there are three main landfills in Trinidad and Tobago: the Beetham landfill, the Guanapo landfill, and the Forest Park landfill. And most of the waste in Trinidad and Tobago reaches these landfills. And these landfills came under the management of the Solid Waste Management Company Limited of Trinidad and Tobago in the year 1993, and before they were classified as open dumps. And this map illustrates the location of the three main landfills in Trinidad and Tobago. Now it is identified that landfills have negative impacts on the environment. So surface winds can carry landfill gas into communities, and the toxic elements from the atmosphere can cause respiratory problems in persons located close to these landfills. Also, landfill gas can migrate underground and can pose an explosive hazard to nearby homes and manholes. However, how can we prevent this from happening? Solution: landfill gas to energy projects. Now, these projects came into being in the 1970s, but implementation only started in the late 1990s, and it was shown in the United States that they are dependable, have cost savings, and efficient. Also, the issues of climate change and renewable energy has spurred growth of these types of projects. And these types of projects can be either used for direct use or electricity generation, and this project look at electricity generation. The research structure is as follows. First, we'll estimate the methane emissions from the three major landfills in Trinidad and Tobago and calculate the amount of electricity that can be generated. Then execute the cost and benefit analysis and make an overall conclusion in terms of feasibility of the project. In terms of the methodology, for estimating methane emissions, the research uses the IPCC 1996 revised guidelines for estimating greenhouse gases. Basically, there are 4 steps, and the methodology gives a simple enough process to estimate. And in terms of electricity generation, the research uses the United States EPA conversion factors. And the results are as follows. For the Beetham landfill, it is estimated that 3.1554 gigograms of methane is emitted annually. And this boils down to 1.418 megawatts of electricity per minute that can be generated if you capture the methane and combust. And accounting for parasitic loss, this would give to 1.2 megawatts that can be utilized for distribution in the national electricity grid. In terms of the Forest Park landfill, 1.84 gigograms of methane is emitted. And this boils down to 2.83 megawatts per minute of electricity that can be generated. And accounting for parasitic loss, this gives 0.7055 megawatts per minute. And the Gunapo landfill, 0.96 gigograms of methane is emitted annually, which boils down to 0.435 megawatts per minute, and parasitic loss, accounting for parasitic loss, gives 0.37 megawatts. In terms of the cost analysis, the research used the landfill cost web model provided by the United States EPA for this specific purpose. And it gives an economic feasibility assessment of the project, and what is used to look at the cost of the main types of electricity generating technologies. In terms of methodology, you look at the benefits in terms of the amount of methane mitigated, the amount of carbon mitigated by using methane as a fuel source instead of fossil fuels, and the amount of electricity generated. And this is the results for the Beetham, Forest Park, and Gunapo landfill. And in summary, the yellow highlighted column is the only type of electricity generation technology which is shown to be economically feasible by looking at the internal rate of return and the net present value. For the Beetham landfill and the Forest Park landfill, none of the technologies was, in terms of cost, was economically feasible. In terms of the benefits, it was estimated that per year, from the 3 landfills, that 118,982 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year would be mitigated. In terms of carbon dioxide mitigated, 735,012, and in terms of electricity for distribution, 136 megawatts. In conclusion, there is potential for landfill gas to energy project to be implemented in Trinidad and Tobago, which will reduce methane and carbon dioxide emission and foster proper solid waste management at the nation's landfill. The Gunapo landfill gas to energy project can be a pilot project for the country's drive for renewable energy development by utilizing landfill gas as a fuel source. And once this project, a project of this nature, comes on stream and is proven to be successful, it can act as a model for other Caribbean islands. Therefore, landfill gas to energy projects is a solution for renewable energy and sustainable waste management in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Good morning to the Chair, the Head of Department, all other protocol officers. I'm excited to have been given this opportunity to present my ongoing research onto an indicative sustainability index to measure our country's progress towards sustainable development. I'm excited for a number of reasons, first of which, COTE this year is honoring the late Professor Dennis Panton, but mostly because the United Nations, come next September, is set to adopt it just negotiated Sustainable Development Goals, putting sustainable development on the world stage like never before. The rationale behind my research is simple. I wanted to do a review of Trinidad and Tobago development from 1960, but from a sustainable development perspective. To answer the question, has the country development been sustainable? But it immediately dawned on me that I need to answer one key question. How do we actually measure sustainable development, given all of its complexities, which isn't captured by the numerous sustainability and development indices around? Thus, I intend to provide a methodological framework for how I intend to go about constructing this Sustainable Development Index. But first, I need to clarify what is meant when we talk about sustainable development, especially in Trinidad and Tobago. If I am allowed to paraphrase Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, ours is a country divided by increasing inequality, increasing wealth, and crippling poverty. We are facing unprecedented environmental challenges where human activity is not only changing the global climate, but also what species survive or become extinct, the quality of the air we breathe, and its health implication. It is an unprecedented challenge that is facing my generation and generation to come. But sustainable development offers us a chance to change our course, putting us on a pathway to the future we want by providing a framework which firstly gives us an understanding of the complexities of the world in which we live, how our environment, social, economic, institutional, political, and cultural factors all fit together. Secondly, it gives us goals on how we can make the world both prosperous and environmentally sustainable. So generally, when we speak of sustainable development, we usually think of it from the three-dimensional model. I took a different approach, where I looked at it from the four-dimensional model, where the ecological dimension talked about the need to decouple total throughput or GDP from the physical production that leads to worsening environmental degradation, loss of genetic diversity among species and ecosystem, and the multiple threats related to climate change and climate volatility as a result of human activity. Economic sustainability generally means progress. Generally means that economic progress must be sustainable for the future generation, which means recognizing the practical limitation by applying economic sustainability rules without additional environmental, social safeguards, where natural capital, which cannot be replaced by human capital, should be preserved for future generation. And with respect to the fourth dimension, institutional sustainability, according to Spanberg 2008, it is needed for any effective compliance among the other three dimensions, and it will complement the other three core dimensions. Right? 12 criticized some authors for failing to recognize institutional sustainability and institutional structures, which are shaped by the formal and informal norms, values, and cultures, which influence behaviors, expectation, and thus significantly impact in terms of promoting sustainable development. So, overview of Trinidad and Tobago. From here on out, I will be providing an overview of Trinidad and Tobago from the economic, social, environmental, and institutional dimension. So, the Trinidad and Tobago has changed significantly over the past 50 years, shifting from agriculture-based to open petroleum economy, and as the World Bank classified, a high-income developing country, where the state or the government is the main driver of economic activity. Over this time, the country has weathered many storms, from social, political unrest, failed coup, many oil crises, and the recent global financial crisis that had led to the crash of a company that controlled over 25% of the country's GDP. Overall, the GDP grew from $500 million in 1960 to $24.6 billion in 2013, largely on the windfall from the oil and gas industry. And the population now enjoy GDP per capita of $14,370. Average growth for the period was 3.4% per annum. Now, having pursued a number of diversification strategies, the country still remained heavily dependent on the energy sector, which alone contributed to 41% of GDP, over 60% of government revenue, over 65% of export, and approximately 93% of FDI and only 3.5% of unemployment in 2013. So how has Trinidad and Tobago developed? Well, from a purely economic perspective, yes, we have increases in wealth, but this is not development, and it should not be mistaken for development. And for far too long, we have misused economic development or economic growth to talk about development. But according to Dudley says, GDP does not give a true picture on the condition under which people live, which Robert F. Kennedy, if I can summarize, GDP doesn't measure, it measures everything in short except what make life worthwhile. So the UNDP in 1990, to move from the income-based indices of measuring development, constructed the first Human Development Index, which is to be used as a measure to better represent human achievement across three main capabilities, namely longevity in terms of life expectancy, knowledge measured by adult literacy and the combination of primary, secondary, and tertiary enrollment, and standard of living measured by GNP per capita PPP. As of 2013, Trinidad and Tobago was ranked 64th with a value of 0.66, placing it in the high human development category. However, 0.76. The AGI doesn't speak to the quality of life that person live, as long and healthy life doesn't mean that the person is not suffering from illnesses such as hypertension, diabetes, cancer, HIV, Alzheimer's, or obesity. It doesn't even measure on issues of inequality in terms of whether or not in a society there's equal access to resources, health and educational services, whether the wealth distribution, or in terms of income, where according to a report in the Express earlier this year, the average male earns 50% more than the average female, every dollar the average female earns. And lastly, to skip over what the AGI doesn't capture in terms of the education, lastly, the AGI doesn't capture environmental effects, which affects everyday life, such as environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, pollution, and energy use, just to name a few. So to touch on some of the social issues, as you can see from this graph, please forgive the years it changed from, I was changing from my Mac to PowerPoint. Yes, as you can see from this graph, while in 2006, the multidimensional poverty index was 1.7% of the population, but according to that same report in the Express earlier this year, the national poverty rate is over 20%. And sadly, we skip. Okay. Okay. Just to skip forward, the country is ranked 83rd and 92nd in terms of the Corruption Performance Index and the Global Competitive Index, respectively. It has an ecological footprint of 7.6 global hectares per capita, and that means it would take 2.8 times a larger planet to be within a sustainable limit. This was going to be a video that shows the rise in sea level due to climate change. And as we can see, that by a 3-meter rise, Port Spain and most of our coast will be devastated. And most of our population live on the coastlines. And this data was compiled from NASA. From these graphs, what I'm sure that there's a parallel increase in terms of our CO2 emissions and our transportation and how much vehicles we have on the road. And we have one of the lowest costs in terms of energy due to the fuel subsidies. This graph also shows that there's a parallel increase in terms of our increase in income, in terms of GDP per capita and CO2 emissions. So, a sustainable development strategy. Right? What direction should we take? Well, according to Ban Ki-moon, sustainable development offers a framework to generate economic growth, social justice, environmental exercise, stewardship, and strengthen our governments. So these are just some national sustainable development strategies from selected countries. Pay particular attention that most of the countries except Trinidad and Tobago has defined sustainable development framework which articulate a vision, identifiable goal, targets, timeline, and indicators to help monitor and evaluate progress towards sustainable development. New Zealand actually adopted the Swiss MONE framework. The Swiss MONE framework for its SDI, for its Sustainable Development Strategy, while Korea uses the UNCSD framework for theirs, and Portugal is the only other country that has the four-dimensional model. With respect to Trinidad and Tobago Sustainable Development Strategy, when asked anybody from the Ministry of the Government, they would point to the Medium-Term Development Framework and the new National Spatial Development Plan strategy. Right? This point to 12 objectives basically and 24 policy areas, but this says nothing about implementation, target, and timeline. Right? This is just the UN goal, how the goals align with the four dimensions, and this is basically the methodology. So I combined the UN's Commission on Sustainable Development method and the Swiss MONE framework. The Swiss MONE framework gives you the level, capital, input, output, and structural criteria for how variables to be selected, and the indicators and dimensions and teams are represented by the UNCSD framework. Overall, I propose that the structure of the framework the SDI be structured within the 17 goals, 170 targets, 44 dimensions, 15 teams, 42 indicators, and there's over 500 variables to choose from.
Good morning, everyone. All protocols being observed. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I'm here to present a topic on the application of qualitative geographic information systems, QGIS, to the study of community decline in Liberia, Trinidad. My co-collaborator, he's right in the corner there, Jason Tammy. Yeah, for the people. So this is an overview of our presentation. Natural resource dependent communities, community decline led civil society. Well, we'll give a description of our context, Liberia, Trinidad, our research questions, our methodology, findings, and some general recommendations. So first things first, natural resource dependent communities are driven by the activity of industries which extract or process any resource or resources found in the surrounding areas of any particular community. For the purposes of this study, community decline is defined as a reversal of the gains the community would have attained as a result of this activity. And civil society, natural resource dependent communities emerge to ensure that residents benefit from natural resources and to counter the negative issues which may arise as a result of having natural resources. So this map represents our study area. I'm just going to give you a background to the context. Liberia, Trinidad is documented as being one of the first industrialized areas in the English-speaking Caribbean, which according to Beckford, experienced an opening up effect as a result of the extraction of asphalt and oil in the area. The big three, as they call them, companies were established. You have Texaco, an American company, Van Leer, a British, a Dutch company, sorry. Then there is Trinidad Lake Asphalt, which is an English company owned by Privity. And these three companies, when they were established in Liberia, as a result of the industrial activity, Liberia became known as a boom town, where, when you look at the statistics, the census indicated that the population had risen to 4,800 during the pre-independence period. Then there was the establishment of a public market, a fish depot, a magistrate's court. Then there were other areas that were established that allowed the area to be characterized as a boom town during that point in time. It's explored in the wider paper. These are our major research questions. What insights into community decline can the phenomenological approach to qualitative research provide? What meanings do civil society leaders attach to the process of community decline? How do people view their community spatially? And how different is the subjective versus the objective considerations of Le Bray as a geographical district? This is our methodology. It's a conceptual framework that we came up with to describe our methodology. What happened is, in the literature concerning the merging of qualitative research with geographic information systems, there was a gap where the process that they went through to merge the strands, they found that there wasn't a clear articulation of the way in which the strands were merged. So we're calling this, the tentative name for now, it's an emergent phase related activity, because qualitative research is grounded in being inductive, where each phase, the data collected at each phase of the research process was used to inform the other phases. So phenomenology, these are the phases, geographic information system, and of course the product of the merging of the two strands. So phenomenology, the first strand, data collection, we use the purposive sampling method. Our target population was civil society leaders. We set preset characteristics, must be native to Le Bray, must be a functioning community group within the last 10 years, etc. 14 groups were found to correspond to the preset criteria. However, only 9 groups expressed their willingness to be participants for this study. We use in-depth semi-structured interviews, and we use a phenomenological interviewing format, which states you focus first on life histories, then you conduct interviews asking about the experience, about the phenomenon, for them to define the phenomenon. And then the last interviewing phase is based on an intersection between their life histories and their experience with the phenomenon. Data analysis, we use phenomenological reduction, which trimmed the data to 88 significant statements. Out of these 88 significant statements, we got 9 clusters of formulated meanings and 4 themes. So this will be indicative of the descriptive and interpretive phase of our findings, the clusters of significant statements and the formulating meanings. Clusters of significant statements on history, education, employment, and land tenure. The meaning is that they still see us as slaves. Corporate social responsibility. Most residents do not benefit from the wealth extracted from our area. Dispossession and powerlessness. It's too easy to take things away from us. Protest, migration, disenchantment, and withdrawal. Different groups respond differently to community decline. Poor communication, voting patterns, party politics, and geographical bias. Good governance is almost impossible. Demographic transition. The elderly are dying without passing on their ways of living. Livelihood and long-term development. There's an absence of sustainable development initiatives in Le Bray. And co-optation, infighting, and opportunity hoarding. Civil society must exist as an independent and empowered entity. So this is the action phase of the research project, where when we looked at the transcripts of the interviews, there were a lot of territorial statements. So what we did is each of the community members of civil society, we gave them clear sheets and asked them to create free recall sketch maps to map these territories or spaces which are experiencing different forms of decline. What we did is that all of the community leaders met with those 9 individual maps, and then we made an amalgamation of all of the 9 maps. So this is a subjective map, which they came up with the color codes as well, which represent the domains of decline. Right? So the green areas were areas which are experiencing socio-cultural decline, decline in family life, decline in civic activity, decline in values like obligation and expectation, etc., as they defined it. The blue area, structural decline, because the companies had established most of these amenities, the community center, the 4 housing developments, etc., which from that time in the 1960s up until this present time has experienced some form of decline. And a number of public institutions, the market, the fish depot, the magistrate court, the banking agency, etc., were closed down during that period. Demographic factors, aging, and not only that, in-migration of immigrant groups and low-income groups, and then political economy, which is related to anything that's associated with the Regional Corporation Office, the Le Bray Industrial Development Corporation, Lake Asphalt, etc. So again, This represents the action phase of the phenomenological research strand. Next comes our second research method, geographic information systems, where we used, this is phase one, digitizing of the satellite image. Remember, one of our research questions is a comparison of objective and subjective. So in terms of the digitizing of the satellite image, this is Lebre. The map on the left represents Lebre, right? And then through using points, lines, and polygons, the actual space, which represents reality, was translated into GIS. Then the second stage will be georeferencing. That map that the villagers created was georeferenced onto the satellite image. And then there was the digitizing of the sketch maps until reality. And then finally, here it is, a comparison was made between reality on the left, which is the satellite data, and then the subjective maps that was generated by the community leaders. These are some of our findings, and we got 67 territorial statements on all of these spaces. However, this is just 19 for the purposes of time, etc. So the dark orange spaces represents the actual size that's found on the satellite image, and then the perceived size will be the light orange. 10 out of 19 spaces, you found that the actual spaces were greater than or larger than the smaller spaces. Basel Hill, Cassava Alley, and Helltown. Civil society leaders may have seen these places to be smaller, because of the less importance that they place on them, and there has been an absence of any sort of activity within these areas. Basel Hill and Cassava Alley were described as spaces experiencing demographic transition with a high degree of aging, and this was held as responsible for decline in family life and socio-cultural values. Helltown was identified as a spot that declined as a result of in-migration of lower income groups and immigrants. Then, 9 out of the 19 spaces on the subjective map was greater than the objective map. Cashew Patch, Harrison Park, and Point Door are some examples. People may perceive these spaces to be larger than reality because of how important they are to them. Cashew Patch, as when we went through, has a very detailed pass where it is a symbol in the community of the days when persons in Lebre weren't so dependent. Animal husbandry, they used to rear animals in that specific space. It's amazing when we analyze the space, there's an abattoir was established because of that. Further up the road, and then there was the public market. So there was a link or a nexus between that form of livelihood, the abattoir where they kill the animals, and the market. Surprisingly, decline has occurred. The abattoir has deteriorated. It's only open 1 day for the week, and the market has totally closed down. Moving along quickly. Findings, subjective map. What we did in terms of the data, we did an intensity map where we took the transcripts and we did an enumeration or word frequency query of the territorial statement using NVivo 10, which is a qualitative data analysis software package. And when we enumerated the territorial statements, we got different representations of the domains of decline. Where, as you all can see from the color coding, what happened is that different perspectives were unearthed about the data. And not only that, structural decline was found to have temporal dimensions, where they noted that certain structures that existed in the past that were functional, like a citrus factory, a cannery, a number of things that does not exist, is not represented in the objective maps. How is the key for sustainable development in the future? Buffers. This is another form of analysis that came out from the data, where to get an idea of community decline, how it may be affected based on the distance from the central business district. So on the left, buffers around the digitized sketch map, what we found is within the inner ring, which is the 250-meter buffer, and we found a predominance, of political economic factors. Then within the 750 buffer, we found a predominance of demographic factors. But then when you look at the same analysis that was applied to the intensity map, you found socio-cultural factors were the predominant factors or domains of decline within that buffer. Moving along. So these are our recommendations, right? Planning and development initiatives should involve an amalgamation of subjective maps, objective maps, and the techniques of qualitative GIS. QGIS has proven to be useful in creating a framework for bridging theory, spatial considerations, and collaborative decision-making because of its potential in bridging the epistemological gap between subjective and objective data. And it gives me an opportunity to build on the work of Dr. Dennis Brown that died, where a lot of his work was focused on bridging that gap to reveal more information about Caribbean livelihoods and Caribbean people. And it's clear when you merge those two strands, look at a different perspective which emerge, which opens up the possibilities for sustainable development, because space of itself is a resource which must be considered when you are looking at sustainable development. QGIS can lead to a more targeted approach to community development and regeneration initiatives. Because you are able to identify the spaces of decline, you can identify the spaces that are for community regeneration. That's making it a more targeted approach. Sometimes it's more miss than hit, but now more hit than miss. Alright? And then finally, QGIS can be used to broaden the scope of the recently instituted Civil Society Network and the Ministry of Planning and Sustainable Development's National Spatial Development Strategy for Trinidad and Tobago. When we look through the literature, only Jamaica and Trinidad has spatial development strategies, but when we went through, there's no mention of the use of QGIS as a potential method that can be used with this specific strategy. And finally, QGIS allows for more of a grassroots or bottom-up approach that is in keeping with the practice of people-centered development.